Hello, Biology 202 students. My name is Jeff Mylander and I will be leading these online lectures for our hybrid version of Bio 202 here at Northern Arizona University. If you haven't already watched the How to Be Successful in Syllabus videos, please do so before watching this lecture as they will prepare you with the details of this course. One of the greatest parts of studying A&P is learning how the puzzle of the human body fits together and the intricacy with how it is controlled and coordinated. We'll start with a quick overview of this semester's labs, briefly review anatomical positioning and microscopy, and then dive into the endocrine system. Make sure you have your notebooks in order to take at least 2 pages of notes and have your lab manuals handy to follow along with the material and diagrams. And just as a reminder, as we go through this lecture, don't forget about the orange questions or comments that pop up on the screen. I encourage you to pause the video to take a few minutes and answer these questions. Reflect on the lecture and the information you're learning, or take a moment to make some drawings in your notebook. In the first half of the semester, we will start with the endocrine system, one of the major pathways your body uses to communicate, control, and keep things in order. Then we will spend 3 weeks going over the circulatory system. We will discuss blood and its cellular and non-cellular components, the pump that moves it, and the vessels or roadway of that system. After that, we will learn about the lymphatic system, how it recycles fluid, helps keep the body clean, and plays a role in your immune system. In the second half of the semester, we will learn how the respiratory system works together with the circulatory system in order to transport gases throughout your body, how we remove wastes and regulate our body's fluid levels with our urinary system, how you deliver nutrients to each and every one of your cells through the digestive system, and probably the most interesting, fun, and exciting systems to learn about, the male and female reproductive systems. To review, what is anatomical position? You might remember from 201 that anatomical position is the body being upright, facing forward, arms and legs straight, palms facing forward, feet flat on the ground, and the eyes are open. But why is anatomical position important? It's important because it allows us a standard frame of reference when discussing the body or structures. The right arm is always the right arm no matter where you are standing in relation to the right arm. Or the anterior side of the heart is always the anterior side of the heart. This avoids confusion when you are communicating with other professionals in your field. Think back to when you took 201. What are some of those directional terms you learned and what do they mean? Take a minute without looking and try to write them out and define them. If you struggled with these before, make sure you spend some time practicing and relearning these as you move forward in 202 because you will be using them quite a bit. How about anatomical planes? Do you remember what these are? These are imaginary lines passing through the body. Can you name some examples? The first is the sagittal plane. In this example, the red line passing through the body specifically represents a mid-sagittal plane, and it divides the body into equal left and right halves, while the yellow line would be referred to as the parasagittal. There are infinite parasagittal planes, but they are divided into unequal left and right halves. Next, we have the frontal or coronal plane, which divides the body into anterior and posterior halves, as you can see represented by the blue line. And last, we have the horizontal or transverse plane, which divides the body into superior and inferior portions. How about a little practice? What planes do we have here? The first one is sagittal, the second one is the frontal plane, and the third one is the transverse plane. Next is microscopy. This should be a review for most of you. If you've made it this far, chances you've had some experiences with scopes. How do you carry a microscope? Always with 2 hands, just like a baby. Set it down gently and don't slide it around. Where do you place the specimen or slide? You should be putting that on the stage and securing it in with the stage clips. How about adjusting a microscope? Start with a low power, also called the scanning lens or the 4x objective, and use the coarse objective knob, the big one medially located closest to the arm. Bring the specimen into focus and then use the fine-tuning dial after that. If you need to move up in magnification, change to the next highest magnification and only use fine focus from here on out. Do not use the oil immersion lens. You will only need to use the low, medium, and high objectives in this lab. How about caring for the slides? Always clean the slides with lens paper, not your shirts, and return them to the slide boxes and double check you haven't left any on the microscope stage when you put the microscope away. If you need more info or want a review about how to use microscopes, please check out this instructional video. If you think you need a break, this may be a good point to take a quick break before jumping into the endocrine system. We have about 35 slides to go over, so you can start this system later when you're feeling more refreshed. The study of endocrinology can be traced back to China over 2,000 years ago. The word endocrine derives from the Greek words endo, meaning within, and krinos, meaning to secrete. This system is a collection of glands that produce hormones that regulate functions such as metabolism, growth, development, tissue function, sexual function, reproduction, sleep, and mood. Hormone levels that are too high or too low can indicate a problem with the system, and hormone diseases can occur if your body does not respond to hormones in the appropriate ways. We'll see some of those this lecture. Stress, infection, and changes in the body's fluid and electrolyte balance can also affect hormone levels. The most common endocrine disease in the United States is diabetes. To start with the endocrine system, we must clarify the difference between the exocrine and the endocrine system. The exocrine system secretes substances like sweat, saliva, or digestive enzymes through ducts to a surface, and that generally has extracellular effects. The endocrine system, which this lecture is focused on, secretes chemical messengers, which we call hormones, into the bloodstream without the use of ducts, and they have intracellular effects. This system utilizes target cells or organs. These structures have receptors for specific hormones, so when a certain hormone is present, it will bind to that receptor site. Hormones, as I mentioned before, are chemical messengers released into the bloodstream and travel through our circulatory system to target cells. Some examples of these hormones are growth hormone, prolactin, and testosterone, but you will be learning a whole lot more in this lab. Let's start by going over the individual endocrine glands and their associated functions. We'll start with a few that should be familiar from 201. Think back and see if you remember this gland. This is the pineal gland, and if you remember, it is involved with circadian rhythms and produces melatonin at night, which helps make you sleepy. In the winter months, people tend to make more melatonin because of the reduced daylight hours. In places of the world that are at higher latitudes with very low amounts of daylight in the winter months, some people will experience seasonal affective disorder, which can produce depression or irritability. This can be reduced with phototherapy and exercise. Research shows that blue light from phones and computer screens stimulates the pineal gland, which means it doesn't produce as much melatonin, so it is recommended to stay off any technology for at least an hour before you go to bed in order to fall asleep easier. If you're like most people, you're probably checking your email or sending a text message to somebody before you head off to bed. Many phones have a blue light filter in your settings that you can activate to reduce that blue light and reduce that stimulation of your pineal gland. How about this gland in orange? If you said the hypothalamus, you would be correct. This gland is extremely crucial to our bodies. It connects the nervous and endocrine systems and controls many functions like hunger, thirst, mood, and regulation of other hormones. It responds to incoming stimuli and secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones, which regulates the secretion of hormones from the pituitary gland. We will be studying the hypothalamic-pituitary interactions in depth as we move forward in this lecture. All right, how about this gland? This is the pituitary gland. It's also called the hypophysis. And do you remember what bone surrounds and protects it? That's the sphenoid bone. The hypophysis rests in the hypophyseal fossa. See, all those bone structures you learned in 201 really were important. The hypophysis has two lobes. The anterior lobe is also called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is also called the neurohypophysis. This diagram represents some of the hormonal control patterns that exist between the hypothalamus and the hypophysis. This top row represents the releasing and inhibiting hormones secreted from the hypothalamus. For the purposes of this lab, you will not need to know the specific names of each of these hormones, but you should know that releasing and inhibiting hormones are released from the hypothalamus. This middle row represents the hormones produced and released by the anterior pituitary. You will need to know all of these hormones and their associated functions. This last row represents the target tissues or the functions of those hormones. So let's look at an example. While you were young and growing rapidly, your hypothalamus was receiving stimuli for growth. It produced growth hormone, releasing hormone, which traveled through capillaries into the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary responds to the presence of those hormones and produces growth hormone. Growth hormone is then released into the circulatory system and travels throughout your body to all of the tissues that are growing. As you reach your maximum age, signals are sent back to the hypothalamus, which produces growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That hormone signals the anterior pituitary to reduce its production of growth hormone and reduce the concentration going to your tissues. Let's take a closer look at this interaction between the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Here in the hypothalamus, we have neuroendocrine cells. They receive neuronal input and in response make hormones. Down here by this arrow, we have the anterior pituitary. We'll come back in a few slides and look at the posterior pituitary. Remember all those hypothalamic hormones we said? For this lab, you can just refer to them as releasing and inhibiting hormones. When the neuroendocrine cells are stimulated, the hormones travel down the axons which lead to a primary capillary bed. Due to the concentration gradient, the hormones diffuse into the capillary beds. They travel through portal venules into secondary capillaries around the anterior pituitary. Remember our growth hormone example? Here, the releasing hormones, represented by the black dots, diffuse out of the secondary capillaries and bind to receptors in the anterior pituitary. Here, they stimulate the production and release of growth hormone. The growth hormone, represented by the red dots, diffuses into the secondary capillaries and out into circulation. This movement of the hormones, or diffusion, happens as a result of the concentration gradients in each area. All of these anterior lobe hormones are released or inhibited by this control mechanism. The last bit of terminology you will need to know from this slide is that when we see two sets of capillary beds like we did in this example, we refer to it as a portal system. Get used to that term because you will see more portal systems throughout the body as we progress through this semester. You won't need to know these specific cell types, but you will need to know the difference between the adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis under the microscope. The key is that the adenohypophysis is highly cellularized because it is responsible for making its own hormones. Each of these cell types produces and secretes specific hormones. Because you are at NAU and Flagstaff, it is fitting to use FLAG-PT as a mnemonic to help you remember the 6 anterior pituitary hormones. We will look at each of these hormones and their associated functions now. For tests, you will be required to know and refer to all hormones by their full names, not just their abbreviations. Both males and females produce follicle-stimulating hormone, but they have different functions in the different genders. In females, follicle-stimulating hormone plays a role in the menstrual cycle, develops the follicle, and regulates blood estrogen levels. In males, it helps produce sperm in the testicles. Again, both males and females produce luteinizing hormone. In females, it plays a role in the menstrual cycle, is responsible for ovulation, and helps regulate blood estrogen and progesterone levels. In males, it stimulates the interstitial cells to release testosterone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone acts on the adrenal gland and stimulates the production and release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. Earlier, I talked about how growth hormone promotes cell and tissue growth, but it is also involved with protein synthesis, homeostasis, and many other cellular functions. Sometimes there can be problems with the endocrine system. If growth hormone is hypersecreted or overproduced, it can lead to pituitary gigantism. If hyposecretion or underproduction occurs, it can lead to pituitary dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism is caused by insufficient growth hormone in childhood, and the body does not receive the right signals. Robert Wadlow, a pituitary giant, was born in 1918 at a normal size. He developed a pituitary tumor as a child, which increased production of growth hormone. He never stopped growing until his death at 22 years of age, by which time he had reached a height of 8 feet 11 inches tall. And Sandra Elaine Allen, an American woman born in 1955, was recognized as the tallest woman in the world during her life according to the Guinness Book of World Records. She was 7 feet 7 inches tall. Acromegaly is a disorder that occurs with an overproduction of growth hormone later in adulthood. It results in a thickening of the bones, generally in the hands, feet, and face. As you can see in this image, the disorder wasn't apparent at ages 9 or 16, but started around age 33 and continued with more obvious symptoms at age 52. The fifth hormone from the anterior pituitary is prolactin. During pregnancy, it increases 10 to 20 times, and it enlarges the mammary glands to promote milk production. This happens when progesterone levels fall and is also stimulated by the suckling response of an infant. You can see the hormonal interactions as illustrated by this diagram. You will not need to know this detailed information for the endocrine system lab, but we will revisit all these hormones in further detail when we go over female reproduction towards the end of this semester. The last of the anterior pituitary hormones is thyroid-stimulating hormone, and it does just that. Stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. Now back to the hypothalamus. Take a minute here to pause the video and study this image. What differences do you see between the interactions of the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary versus the interactions of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary? What you should have noticed in this image is that the neuroendocrine cells in the hypothalamus extend all the way into the posterior pituitary, and it does not have a portal system present. The two hormones released from the posterior pituitary are ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Unlike the anterior pituitary, these hormones are made in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary. They are not produced by the posterior pituitary. Here is a histological view of the posterior pituitary. Remember its other name, neurohypophysis. This lobe is mostly composed of nervous tissue rather than highly cellularized like the adenohypophysis. This is an image that more closely resembles what you will see in lab. You can see here that the anterior lobe stains darker and appears denser than the posterior lobe. The first of the posterior pituitary hormones we'll look at is antidiuretic hormone. Remember, it is produced by the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary. As you will soon learn in the urinary system, antidiuretic hormone helps to reabsorb water from the filtrate back into the blood. A diuretic is something that makes you urinate, so an antidiuretic makes your body reabsorb water. It causes vasoconstriction, which helps increase blood pressure. The other hormone produced by the hypothalamus and released through the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. There is a positive feedback loop between a baby and its mother that facilitates birth. As the baby's head stretches the cervix, there's a signal to the hypothalamus to produce oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions, which pushes the baby further into the birth canal, stretching the cervix, which then signals the hypothalamus for more oxytocin and more contractions. Once the baby is out, the mother will hold the baby on her chest, and the flood of oxytocin helps to develop emotional bonding. There have been a lot of studies done on oxytocin and its connection to various emotions. After the baby starts to feed, we already saw that prolactin stimulates milk production, but oxytocin helps with milk letdown or milk ejection. So as the baby suckles, the milk comes out easier. Oxytocin also helps move semen through the seminiferous tubules in males and travel through the female reproductive tract. And last but not least, oxytocin has been associated with everybody's favorite, orgasm. How about this gland? You've already seen this in this lecture. This is the thyroid gland. Some of the hormones associated with this gland are T3 and T4. These are the only two hormones you can refer to by their abbreviations. T3 is also called triiodothyronine, and T4 is referred to as thyroxine. They are involved with increasing basal metabolic rates. Another hormone released from this gland is calcitonin. Calcitonin reduces blood calcium levels through three mechanisms: increasing calcium excretion in the kidneys, decreasing osteoclast activity, and increasing osteoblast activity. We'll revisit this hormone when we get to the urinary system. Let's take a closer look at the thyroid gland. Here is a diagram showing you structures that you are responsible to know. The thyroid is made up of three parts. The first is the functional unit called the follicle. As you can see here, the follicle is a circular structure that is made up of follicular cells. These are simple cuboidal and have receptors on their surface that bind to thyroid-stimulating hormone. The follicles have a central region called the colloid where thyroid hormone production and storage occurs. Last are the parafollicular cells, also called C cells. They are scattered about in the basement membrane and are responsible for making calcitonin. Here you can see what the thyroid gland will look like under a microscope. Remember, follicle cells are simple cuboidal, a single layer of cube-shaped cells responsible for absorption and secretion. You may have heard the term goiter before. This is an enlargement of the thyroid gland. T3 and T4 require iodine for their production. So if a person is deficient in iodine, it can lead to thyroid hyperplasia, or the increase in tissue to compensate for the lack of efficacy. David Murray Cowie, a professor of pediatrics at the University of Michigan, led the U.S. to adopt the Swiss practice of adding sodium iodide or potassium iodide to salt. In 1924, iodized salt was sold commercially in Michigan and was commonly available in the U.S. In under a decade, over 90% of the salt consumed in the U.S. was iodized, and goiter rates plummeted. On the posterior side of the thyroid, you will find the parathyroid glands, which secrete parathyroid hormone. This works in opposition to calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels by decreasing calcium excretion in the kidneys and by increasing osteoclast activity and decreasing osteoblast activity. The next gland we'll look at is the thymus. Take a moment to study the thymus gland in the newborn on the left and the adult on the right. What do you notice, and why might that be? If you said the thymus gland in the newborn was much larger, you would be correct. This gland is involved with developing the immune system. Newborns don't start developing their immune system for a couple of months after birth. So the thymus gland is much larger at birth to help develop their immune system and mature their T cells. Some new research may suggest that the immune system is suppressed for a couple of months in order for the newborn's gut flora to populate the intestines. As we age, the thymus undergoes involution and shrinks over time. The thymus secretes a hormone called thymosin, which helps in the maturation of T cells. Notice on the histology image that you will need to distinguish between the medulla and the cortex of the thymus gland. The medulla is a deeper portion, and the cortex is the more superficial, darker staining region. I hope you're hanging in there. We're almost done. There are two adrenal glands which sit on top of each kidney. As you can see, the adrenal gland also has a cortex and medulla. The cortex is further divided into regions, which we will discuss in a minute. You can use this image to help you identify the different regions of the cortex when working in lab, but you can also see which hormones are released from each region. Here we have aldosterone, cortisol, androgens, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. The three regions you need to know are called the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. The zona glomerulosa secretes mineralocorticoids to help control electrolyte balance. The zona fasciculata secretes glucocorticoids, which help control protein and fat catabolism and reduce inflammation. And the zona reticularis secretes androgens involved in libido and sexual arousal. The adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are responsible for our fight or flight response. You may remember this from 201 when studying the sympathetic nervous system. The pancreas contains both endocrine and exocrine functions. We will learn more about its exocrine functions during the digestive system, but for now, the endocrine portion has 1 to 2 million pancreatic islets. Pancreatic islets are clusters of alpha, beta, and delta cells. Under the microscope, you will need to be able to identify the pancreatic islets, but you won't need to differentiate between alpha, beta, and delta cells. Alpha cells secrete glucagon when blood glucose levels are low in order to raise blood glucose, and beta cells secrete insulin when blood glucose levels are high in order to reduce blood glucose. During a meal, delta cells secrete somatostatin, which helps suppress the other two until your body has a chance to register how much glucose is actually in the blood. The testes also have exocrine and endocrine functions. Their exocrine function is to produce gametes, also called sperm, and the endocrine function is to produce testosterone. We will learn more about the testes when we go over the male reproductive system at the end of the semester, but we'll look at it briefly here. The testes have long tubes which house maturing sperm called seminiferous tubules. Between them are cells called interstitial cells, which are responsible for secreting testosterone. Both males and females produce testosterone and estrogens, but testosterone is usually higher in males and estrogens are usually higher in females. Testosterone is involved in the development of the reproductive system and secondary sex characteristics in males, as well as stimulating sperm production and controlling libido. Here you can see the structures we discussed. You can see the sperm developing in the walls of the seminiferous tubule, and as they mature, they make their way towards the lumen. The interstitial cells, which release testosterone, are found between the seminiferous tubules, while the sustentacular cells provide nutrition for the developing sperm. We will also study the female reproductive system in depth towards the end of the semester, but we will briefly look at the ovaries and their associated hormones. Like the pancreas and testes, the ovaries have exocrine and endocrine functions. The exocrine function is to produce gametes, or eggs, while the endocrine function is to produce estrogen and progesterone. These hormones are responsible for secondary sex characteristics in females, development of the breasts, and regulating the menstrual cycle. For the purposes of this lab, you will need to know what hormones the ovaries produce and what the associated functions are. The structures in this image will give you an idea of what we learn later in the semester and what the ovaries look like under a microscope. So that's it. There's a lot to study for the first week and a lot of histology to practice. A few reminders for your first lab. Be prepared to turn in your signed syllabus contract. Clarify any questions about the lab you may have with your lab TA. Make sure you notify him or her about any excused absences you have coming up. Bring your review questions to work on in lab if you have time, but focusing on the histology will be a better use of your time. Test 1, which will happen during week 2, will have 17 questions from lab 1 and 3 questions from lab 2 if you are in a hybrid version. If you're in a regular in-person lab and watching this lecture for review, you will have 18 questions from lab 1 and 2 questions from lab 2. Be sure to watch these lectures before coming to lab each week. The next lab will be over blood and blood typing. Best of luck studying this week, and don't forget to spend time in open labs.